All right. The book of First Corinthians uh, is kind of like Paul's other books, but it's a little bit different. Paul frequently he develops principles in the first half of the book or first section, and then he'll make application of those principles. While this book has a little bit different, he does develop a bunch of principles, but we had problems in the church starting in chapter 1, and information came by word of mouth to Paul from the house of Chloe about some things that were occurring. And he may have gotten information from other sources. Of course, the Holy Spirit could have even given him information. But what we see here now, we're going to see that now it appears that the church had sent him questions. And these questions are introduced with the words now concerning. Now concerning. And we find those questions in chapter 7, verse 1, verse 25, chapter 8, 1, 12, 1, and 16, 1. I do not take the position that this chapter is talking about marriage directly. I take the position that it's talking about celibacy. All right. And that makes perfectly good sense to me. And marriage comes into the picture as it relates to celibacy. Okay. And I think when we get into that, well, I think you'll see what I'm talking about. In this chapter, I think it's more defense of celibacy than discussion of marriage. Paul encourages celibacy for a particular situation. He said, now concerning the things whereof you wrote. So now here's something they wrote about him. So concerning what you wrote to me about. So we have a question to ask. We don't have the question. We have the answer to the question. So we don't know exactly what the question was. We have an answer to the question. Pretty good reason to expect the question to be something about marriage or celibacy or something to that effect because of the answers he gives. He said it's good for a man not to touch a woman, see? But that goes contrary to Hebrews 13:4 and other passages that marriage is honorable in all and the bed undefiled. So marriage is a good thing. Several passages tell us that. But so we have to ask ourselves, this is kind of puzzling. Why does he say it's good for a man not to touch a woman? We'll have to look at what that means a bit later. We skip down to verses 26 to 28 of 1 Corinthians 7. And I think, or I deem, I would translate this, I deem, therefore, that it is good by reason of the distress of the bonus, namely that it is good for a man to be as he is. And so to be single, see, in this context, we're talking about people who are single. Well, why would it be good to be single? Because of distress. Now, would it not be more difficult? Now, we're all three married men. Would it not be harder for you to watch your wife being tortured than for them to torture you? Probably would. I imagine all three of us would draw that conclusion. It would be more difficult. And so, again, you have the raw job of taking care of a wife and providing for her. But if it's in periods of great persecution, if you have to flee to get away, then you have to take her with you. And that may be more difficult, particularly if they're little children. That makes it even more difficult. And so that's by the reason of the distress. That's your persecution. It's a bonus. Art thou bound unto a wife? If you're married, he cautions them. Now, I'm not telling you to divorce your wife. Seek not to be loosed. Don't do that. I'm not telling you that. I'm telling you, art thou loose from a wife? Now, there's two ways a man could be loose from a wife. When my first wife died, I was loose from a wife. and a man who's scripturally divorced, I believe, is loose from a wife. And so there would be two categories there that are loose from a wife. Seek not a wife. He's telling them, so just stay single. Don't seek a wife. And we'll come back to it later when we get to the verse. But shouldest thou marry, he says, now listen, I'm not telling you it's a sin to marry. he says, I conclude that it is good. Why? Because of persecution, see. But shouldest thou marry, thou hast not sinned. So he's telling them to warn them right up. I didn't tell you it was a sin to get married. I'm just telling you it's not the best thing. It's not wise. It's not going to be helpful. It's going to be more difficult for you. Your life's not going to be as pleasant as it could be because we are being persecuted right now. The church is. And that's what Paul is saying. Now, we in America right now don't have this kind of persecution, but they do in some places. She has not sinned. If a virgin marries, she has not sinned. So the first group is someone who's loose from a wife. That would be a widower or a scripturally divorced man. Then you're not married. You're not sinned if you marry. And if a virgin married, now the virgin here could refer to a male or a female. That would be someone who's never been married. She has not sinned here. So I'm not telling you it's a sin to get married. I'm just telling you it's not the best thing, not the wisest thing. Yet such shall have tribulation in the flesh, and I would spare you, see. Here's the reason, because I don't want you to have trouble in the flesh. It's going to be hard enough to live as a Christian if you got a wife and perhaps little children tagging along. And if they take your children and torture them while you have to watch, it'll be hard, make it real difficult. I think all three of us can see how that would be harder on us than if they tortured us. Would you both agree with me? I think you would. Okay. But I say to the married, unmarried, and to widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. So Paul was a single man, okay? He was unmarried. We see this in 1 Corinthians 9:7. Have we no right to lead about a wife that is a believer, even as the rest of the apostles and the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas? Cephas is Peter, right? Since Paul had the right to have a wife, I conclude he was either scripturally divorced, a widower, or he had never been married, one of those three. I don't see another fourth category. Okay. Paul probably was part of the Sanhedrin. I don't think you could be in part of the Sanhedrin without being married. So I would say he's probably therefore either scripturally divorced or he was a widower. Some think he was a widower. Okay. All right. But we can't prove that. And it's not critical for our interpretation of the Bible. No doubt Paul admonished them regarding this matter, and he already talked about it. So they wrote him a question about it. Now, what's your teaching on this? Are you telling us we shouldn't get married? No, he's clarifying it. It's best not to get married because of persecution, but I'm telling you it's not a sin to get married. So he's told them clearly it's not a sin. So it's just advice. All right. Note they were misunderstanding on some things. Some were defrauding their mates, withholding their bodies in the area of conjugal relations, 1 Corinthians 7:5. Defraud you not one to the other except to be by consent. We'll get to that later. For a season that you may give yourselves under prayer may come together again. Satan tempts you not because you're a failure to have exercise self-control and continence. Right? He had advised the widows and unmarried to remain single. They thought they would remain single. And they thought they would remain even if they burned with desire. And so he's telling them, if you can't contain yourself, go ahead and marry. He's not telling people who don't have the right to marry, right? So he's not giving a blank check to marry for any reason if you're unscripturally divorced, for example. Or it's better to marry than to burn. Now, I've had people that have used this to try to say, well, we can get married if we can't contain ourselves, even though we're not scripturally divorced. Okay, and what they're doing is they're making an argument here by assumption. Some were divorcing their rights. I think we can see this in order to live in celibacy. I think we see this in chapter 7, verse 10 and 11. I would come to that. And I think we see some were divorcing their unbelieving mates. And so this probably was a spin-off from the idea of what had happened in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. And it might have been Judaizing teachers that were teaching this, okay? So one more note out saying that a virgin could not marry. We see this in chapter 7, verse 25 through 28, and also verse 38. We'll come to that later. So I think the chapter is tempered, or we want to season it like you season your food with salt, by the persecution of the church that the church was enduring at this time. And I would argue here is a principle of Bible interpretation. If two passages seem to contradict each other, either one or both must be limited in some manner, such as in time, place, what covenant it's under, or to whom it's directed, and so forth. All right. In Genesis 1, God said he saw it and it was very good. In Genesis 6, it was not good. So is there contradiction? No, there's a difference in time of about 1,500 years approximately. And so things have changed. For instance, the command, thou shalt not kill, Exodus 20:13, the Decalogue, 10 Commandments, is explained in detail in later chapters and books. Some of the modern translations correctly translated here as thou shalt not commit murder, shalt not murder. And of course, we see this in the Old Testament that allowed capital punishment, both the Old and the New Testaments. It didn't hold a person guilty of accidental homicide, killing someone by an accident. It wasn't considered to be murder. Right? We see this in Deuteronomy 19, verses 4 through verse 13. Right? God doesn't contradict himself, so we have to interpret it, find find the harmony that's there. We're just missing it. We need to look for the harmony that's, or we know has to exist in God's word. God's law regarding murder is a timeless law, and we know this because it was given in all three dispensations. Genesis 6, 9:6, the patriarchal dispensation, Exodus 20:13, the Mosaic dispensation, Romans 13:9, the Christian dispensation. Now, some laws have changed, but some are timeless. All right. Now, concerning what the things were you wrote, look here. It's good for a man not to touch them. God said it's not good to live for a man to live alone. Genesis 12:2-18. Therefore, marriage is good. The writer of Hebrews wrote that. Marriage is honorable in all, and bed undefiled. So there's a contradiction? No, there's no contradiction. This is for a time of persecution. It's limited to that realm. And he's telling them in a time of persecution, you might be better off not to marry, but you're not sinning to even then to marry. It's just that you're going to have a harder time living as a Christian. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions?
Just a comment.
Yes.
I would make a guess that the comments throughout 1 Corinthians regarding marriage, that people will seek to use that in and of itself versus other verses which would place restrictions on marriage, divorce, and that kind of thing.
Yes, some do. They definitely do. They want to pit Paul against Jesus, and they harmonize. We'll see this. All right. So we need to be very careful of that. All right. Now let's go to chapter 7, verse 1. We spent a few minutes, about 15, roughly 17 minutes, trying to give some background for this. So let's start with 1 Corinthians 7, chapter 7, verse 1. And Chris, can you read this for us and translate it for us?
Yes. Pere de on egorapete moi alone anthropo gunakois me aptisthe. Let's see, aptisthe. All right. I have now concerning the things about which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to carnally touch a woman. I inserted carnally there, but to touch a woman.
Okay. Not to touch. Okay. Now concerning the things you wrote. See, this same expression is going to be found in those other passages where I noted it. So I think this is introducing a question that they had asked him. Now concerning the things you wrote, and then he'll say, and he'll later just say, but now concerning. They won't have the things you wrote again, I don't think. So we had those passages introduced. Let me go back, find it right quick. Right here. Verse 25, chapter 1, 12, 1, 16, 1. That's kind of like a formula introducing their questions. Right. All right. The things wherever you wrote. So they wrote something to Paul, and it doesn't say that they wrote what they wrote, but we know they wrote. And concerning things you wrote to me. Now, some of the texts don't have this word. This word's omitted from text. And we didn't want to have copies of their question, but look at the text. It's in the majority text in all these other manuscripts right here. All these here. Right? And it's left out of these manuscripts down here. And I just have to believe it's there, okay? I think the evidence is too overwhelming, okay? Right. So the things where you wrote to me, the American Standard leaves it out. And it leaves it out because the American Standard is based to a large extent on Codex B, which is Vatican manuscript. And this other manuscript not having it would go along with the Codex B, Vaticanus, the Vatican manuscript.
Isn't that what Jerome used?
Probably.
And Aleph, that really has a lot of variances compared to other texts.
Yes, it does. And I, on my materials that I have worked up on the introduction to the Bible, I go through textual criticism in some detail.
Okay, yeah, Tischendorf, I think, found Aleph at Mount Sinai.
Yeah. Yes. It's an olive. This was actually at that monastery, which is claimed to be at Mount Sinai. I don't think Mount Sinai is on the Sinai Peninsula. I think it's on the east bank of the Gulf of Aqaba. It's east of Aqaba, not west.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, where he found the text, though, was in Mount Sinai itself, was it not? Not on the east side?
Yes.
But on the peninsula?
Yeah, it was on the peninsula.
Okay, that's what I
That
thought.
monastery. Okay. We don't have copies of their questions, but we do have it. We can try to deduce them from Paul's answers. All right. So next, I think wherever you wrote, it is good. This is not morally good, as we say, standpoint of goodness, moral goodness. This is good in the sense that it's pleasing to look at, or it has all its parts in the right or harmonious position. It's more balanced and harmonious. It's going to give your life, it's going to make your life easier if you stay single. For a man, now this is a man. Now notice it's anthropos, which can be a woman as well. So, but he does say not to touch a woman. So I think anthropos here is it's a generic term, but I think the principle has to apply to both men and women. But he says it's good for a man, and he uses it here for a male human, probably not to touch a woman. See? So I think it's he didn't use the word aner, a man versus a woman. Now, he's not talking about homosexual marriage. Keep that in mind. That's ludicrous. But what I'm saying is, by using anthropos, he probably makes it generic, and the principle would apply to a woman not touching a man. That is, he says it's better off if you stay single, both you men and women both. So I think the anthropos probably does that for us, and not to touch. And you had this as carnal, is that correct? Is that how you translated it there? And that's what Thayer tells us here, see, if carnal intercourse with a woman. And I don't think he's talking about, he's saying it's good for you not to commit fornication. Although it's good not to commit fornication, he's talking about actually being married and being in the conjugal relations, in a lawful relationship with your wife. Does that make sense? It's a given. He would condemn fornication, but he's talking here about actually being married to someone, and that's my conclusion. It's always translated touched or touched, and so here,
So it's good for a man not to be married to a woman. It talks about a man not to touch a woman. So you're not talking about a husband touching his wife, but rather any man or any woman with somebody of the opposite sex.
Well, I think he's saying here, under this condition, and I think it all has to be under this condition.
The time of stress?
A time of stress. I think
Okay.
talk about. And it's better not to touch a woman and he's saying, and this will be one of the reasons you'd want to get married, conjugal relations. And not the only reason, it shouldn't be the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. And he says, if you're going to argue that, then it's better not to do that because of the present distress. I think that's what he's talking about here. Now, I know the scriptures clearly teach that fornication is sinful. But in this case, he's saying it's better. And so he's not saying it's wrong to touch a woman if you're married to her. See, it's good not to touch, for a man not to touch. Right? And that's probably middle voice. Right? And to fasten yourself to, see, properly to fasten yourself to. Now, look over here. Mary Magdalene was touching Jesus. He said, touch me not. But actually, the American Standard Footnotes has it better. It's this word, stop clinging to me. And that's basically what it's saying. And so you're tied yourself to a woman, and you're joined to her in this relationship. And I don't think I think the carnal intercourse, the relationship, sexual relations, is just part of it. And of course, just being with a woman that you love, just holding hands and so forth, is one of those things it's something good. And but here he's saying even that is better not to be doing under these conditions. It's better not to do it. But he's saying it's good not to do it, but he's not saying it's wrong to do it. We will see this later. So probably better translated not to cling to or fasten oneself. And maybe even talk about cleaving to your wife in Genesis 2:24. By the usage of not may, here he's saying not to have those thoughts in the mind. It's better just to put that out of your mind and fix your mind on how you're going to get through this persecution. Right? Who does not occur with the infinitive, nor even with indirect assertions. Like the participle in Greek, the New Testament infinitive is negated by may. So this is going to may, not to touch. So he uses may here, not to touch, because it's an infinitive. That's why he used it. And you negate an infinitive with may, not who. All right. I translated it now concerning the things whereof you wrote to me. All right. It is good for a man not to fasten himself to a woman. And that's to cling to, see. Or to cling to, probably similar to cleaving. And I gave the scriptures for it. That's my interpretation. Could be wrong. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Try verse 2, if you would, James, if you would, for us.
Okay.
Unless you got the things you want to say about verse 1, go ahead and say them.
No, sir. I'll go ahead and proceed with verse 2.
Okay.
Dia de tas porneas, ekastos tain heautu gunaika ekato kai ekaste ton idion andra eketo. I translated verse 2 as, but on account of the fornications, let each man himself have a wife, and each woman her own husband.
All right. And so the King James reading nevertheless to avoid, but that to avoid's in italics, to avoid fornication, or Mark Standard, because of fornications, let each man have his own wife and each woman have her own husband. But because of, on account of, how did you render that?
But on account of the fornications.
And it's the fornication, see. It's got the article.
Yeah, that's why I rendered it the fornications.
Yeah. Perhaps signifying you had in mind the particular kind of fornications, perhaps those of chapters 5 and 6. Right? So if you just can't contain yourself, you're better off to get married than to commit fornication. I think that's what he's saying, even in time of persecution. So he says, let, this from eketo, which is let have. It's, remember the Greek has eketo. That's a third person imperative. We don't have that in English, third person imperative. And it's not permission necessarily, although it can be, but it's commanding him to have that ability. And indirectly, I guess it's giving him permission to do it. Okay, and each man, and this is each person, each man is masculine, and but I don't think it authorized same-sex marriages. That each man have his own what? His own wife. All right. Now, what they're calling now, homosexuals, they're calling a man, two men homosexuals, one of them's called the husband, one's called the wife. And of course, they're just playing with words. A wife is a woman, a female, okay, in the Bible. Can't be a male. Male can't be a wife in the Bible. Right? I think he's now gives permission to have him in one wife, not a bunch of wives. An old country preacher friend of mine said, God never authorized a man to have a herd of wives. He was an old country preacher. And I thought it was kind of funny the way he worded it. Right. Okay. Gunakai is singular, not plural. And let each woman, now this is feminine, see? So the word each one is hekastos is hekaste. That's feminine, not a singular feminine. So this is a woman now, because it's feminine gender, have her own husband, see now. And again, these lesbians are calling, one of them is the husband, one's the wife. So they're calling a woman a husband here. And of course, that's contrary to the Bible. A husband is masculine. Okay. So it gives permission to have one husband, it gives permission to have one wife. And no more than one. We don't have permission in this verse to have more than one wife or more than one husband. Any questions? So one purpose of marriage is to help people keep from committing fornication. Now let me point this out. Because of fornications, go ahead and get married. Now let me give you this, and we'll be getting into logic next semester. And I want you to see this. A sound argument has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And they're properly constructed. This minor premise is fornication is a sin. And we agree with that. Conclusion, fornication is a thing that a spouse is required to help his or her spouse to abstain from committing. Now, when we see this, this is what he's saying. You can go ahead and get married, and that's going to help you so that you won't commit fornication. Right? So now, there had to have been some kind of a first premise, a major premise here, to justify the conclusion. And we'll see how we can reconstruct the major premise. That's by implication. The unstated major premise of this enthymeme, that's an incomplete argument with an unstated premise, is all sins are things that a spouse is required to help his or her spouse to abstain from committing. I think this is teaching us that God intends for a husband and a wife to do their best to help their spouse to live a life without sin. That's not just in the area of conjugal relations or fornication. It's generic, any kind of sin. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
I think that's the sin Adam committed. I think Adam sinned before Eve did. Because I think he was obligated to protect her from sin, and she was obligated to protect him from sin. When Linda and I got married, we talked about this. We both agree that we need to help each other live a life as much as possible free from sin. And I think that's what we need to be aware of. We're trying to help each other go to heaven. And if you got a wife or a husband that's going to do that, man, that's great. It really helps you get there. All right. Any questions? All right. So this is my conclusion, that this is a principle in the Bible right there from this verse. That's one of the purposes of marriage. Not just conjugal relations, but everything, all sin, try to help each other quit sinning and to live as we ought to. I think God intended both husband and wife help each other to serve God, work as a team to help each other. The major premise can be applied to both sins of omission and sins of commission. From this right here, one reason why it's wise to marry a faithful child of God, a Christian. Because a non-Christian is not going to help you go to heaven as readily as a Christian will. Right? And I never even thought about marrying a non-Christian. I dated some girls, and if I didn't think they weren't Christians, and if I thought they weren't interested in studying the Bible, and I could see that they weren't going to probably be converted, I just quit them. I just stopped. And I began to look for a woman who was a member of the church and was faithful. If the scriptures forbid some to marry, now I want you to notice this, then the expression each man and each woman who were permitted to have a mate, a wife or husband, do not include those forbidden by God to marry. Did you agree with that? This verse can't contradict a passage that says such and such person is forbidden to marry. So the scriptures forbid some to marry, that's my claim. And so each man and each woman here that's permitted to have a mate does not include those that God has forbidden to marry. Okay? Here's an argument of those who claim that there are no limits on marriage, divorce, or remarriage. I've heard this argument. If each man and each woman were permitted to have a mate, a wife or a husband, includes all people, then there is none who are forbidden to marry. And I've heard that. Each man and each woman are permitted to have a mate, includes all people, therefore none are forbidden to marry. There's no limits. Anybody can get married. It's self-evident that this second premise, of course, begs the question. They're assuming that to be the case. Here's my following argument. It applies to certain ones who claim that we are under the same marriage, divorce, or remarriage law that we found in the Old Testament. We're not going to get off and look at all of those passages in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 and so forth. If we're under the same marriage, divorce, or remarriage law as the Old Testament, then women may not divorce their husbands and remarry because they weren't allowed to divorce their husbands under the law of Moses. Only the men could divorce. Right? So women don't have the right to divorce. And I run into some members of the church that say that women don't have the right to divorce because they have, and they've seen this conclusion. And they say, well, this right here is true. And I don't believe it's true. Okay, but we'll have to look at those other passages, and I'm not going to go into them right now. If you want, we could have a class where we look at them. Okay, but note the following arguments from 1 Corinthians 7:2, based on the assumption that we're presently under the same marriage divorce laws found in the law of Moses. If 1 Corinthians 7:2 gives women permission to divorce their husbands and remarry, then women may divorce their husbands and remarry. If it gives permission, then they can do it. That's true. So if hypothetically it gives permission, then they can do it. Women may not divorce their husbands and remarry. This conclusion of the prior syllogism. How's that? Because the law of Moses, if we're under the law of Moses, same law, it didn't permit a woman to divorce and remarry. So our problem is 1 Corinthians 7:2 does not give women permission to divorce their husbands and remarry. Okay? Now, those people that claim this is just a restatement of we're under the same marriage law, they can't make that argument and allow women to remarry, divorce and remarry, because the law of Moses didn't permit it. All right? If the words of 1 Corinthians 7:2 do not give women permission to divorce or to remarry, then the words of 1 Corinthians 7:2 do not give men permission to divorce their wives and remarry. All right? right? The wording of 1 Corinthians 7:2 within itself gives blanket permission to divorce, does not grant blanket permission. The same wording is applied to men and women both. Same wording. The language is identical, say, for both. All right. Now, here's my argument. If the context of 1 Corinthians 7:2 relates to the present distress, then the permission to marry was given to those with a right to marry that he was advising not to marry. He's advising some people not to marry because of present distress, and so he's given them the right to remarry, permission to marry, because they already had that right. And he's just telling them, look, under the present distress, you're better not to marry, but I'm not telling you it's wrong to marry. He's already told them that. And so it relates to the present distress. The permission to marry was given to those with the right to marry that he's advising not to marry because of the present distress, right? Now, is that confusing enough? Any questions? Okay. 1 Corinthians 7:2 explicitly gives a man permission to have one wife, and so it does not justify polygyny, a man having more than one wife. It explicitly gives one permission to have one husband, ton andra. It does not explicitly give permission to have more than one husband, therefore it doesn't justify polyandry. Polyandry is practiced among the lower caste in India, for example. Okay? From Theta and Iota, there's Theta and there's Iota. Above, we conclude that 1 Corinthians 7:2 doesn't justify any form of polygamy, either polygyny or polyandry, having more than one wife or having more than one husband. All right. Now, can a man have more than one wife? Yes, if his one wife dies, for example, he can have a second wife. All right, but he can't have them both at the same time. Okay. All right. We must remember the words hekos, those pos and holos are always limited by the context. And this is the word we have here, but pos and holos also are limited by context. They're rarely universal in scope. If some are forbidden by God to marry, then they're not included in that hekostos. Now, we have some claiming polygamy is allowed. And they claim that polygamy, both polygyny and polyandry, is lawful and is neither explicitly supported by this passage or by any other New Testament. You can't find it in the Bible, not in the New Testament. I believe it was allowed in the Old Testament. We'll talk about that later. But I don't believe that God really ever desired it to happen, but he tolerated or permitted it, allowed it to occur. If polygyny is forbidden, then a married man is not given permission to marry a second wife. It means that the remainder of Scriptures place limits on 1 Corinthians 7:1 and 2. You can't fit this against other verses of Scripture. That's not good hermeneutics. If polyandry is forbidden, having more than one husband, then a married woman is not given permission to marry a second husband in this passage. So a reminder again limits this passage. Any questions? We're getting pretty close to the end of our material. Let's see if we can do verse 3 and then call a halt to it, okay? Back to Chris. Or James, who read first? I think Chris did.
Yeah, I think it's back to me.
Okay, well, can you go ahead and read this, and then we'll finish this verse and quit for the night.
Okay. Te guniki ho andre and Cain ophilo menain eunoion apodidoto, amois de kai he gune to andri. I have let the husband render kind duty to the wife, and likewise also the wife to the husband.
Okay. Let him render kind duty. Okay. Now to the wife, let him render. And that's the apodidomi. It's from apodidomi, to give from, say, and I'll break it apart. Preposition apo and verb didomi. And so it's to give away by giving, to give back or restore unto the wife, to the wife, dative case, and that which is owed to her. And here again, we have some of the texts that don't have this word in it. All right, we'll look at them in just a minute. But this is a debt. I think when we marry, we obligate ourselves to certain things with our spouse. I think when I married my wife, I think I've been married now to two different women. I'm married to one right now, my second wife. I believe when I married both of those women, when I married them, I obligated myself to, I believe, to support them and to do certain things to take care of them. And I believe the scriptures show this. And so right here, there's a duty, there's an obligation. It's a debt I have, right? But it's a debt that I freely chose to engage in. And so it's a compound word. Break it up here, you can see it. For you, that's good, and noia, and that's a mind, right? And so my mind is good, and I have goodwill toward that person. Or it's you noel, and that's a verb form. And so right here, there's your verb form of you noel. Noel is the mind or to know. And right here, so to be well disposed or have a peaceable attitude toward the person. So it means the husbands have a good mind to wish well or to be well disposed toward his wife. Now he's freely chosen to take on this responsibility when he married her, and he should have this. He should give to her due. He owes her right treatment, to have the right mind toward her, have a good mind toward her. Any questions or comments about that? All right. Now let's look at the word up here. We'll go down to the footnote. Majority text has these two words, right? And it's supported by these manuscripts. This word, good mind, is this word here, right here, is omitted in these manuscripts, more so. So we have more of these manuscripts, but the majority text is like 90% of the manuscripts. Now they're not as old, and they treat them as if they're one manuscript because they basically all read pretty much the same way. These other manuscripts don't agree among themselves. All right. All right. So that's something to kind of file in the back of your mind. I think that's significant that they don't agree among themselves. Okay. So I'm going to go with this word being in here. I want you to notice here that render unto the wife due benevolence. All right. Her due. I'm not sure what the text of the American Standard text supported reads, because B, Vaticanus, was one of the main texts that was used for the American Standard, and that they consulted it and were influenced by it quite a lot. And I think this is referring to conjugal relations. Any comments there? They're part of being married. They're part of marriage. Only the word for debt is used here. It's an obligation that one has toward his wife. And that is to be paid with a good mind toward your spouse. All right? You accepted that responsibility when you married her or when you married him if you're a woman. Likewise, the adverb of manner sets forth the duty of the wife to render the conjugal duties to her husband. Also, the wife under the husband. I think it's referring to conjugal relations. Now, why? Because in this context, he's going to go on and elaborate on it in the next verses. It's going to help you keep from committing fornication. All right? I think we both have a duty to love one another. Let me give that, and then we'll be through. Agapao is commanded, the man is commanded to love his wife, agapao. That's a self-sacrificing love, which does what's best for the other person. But the wives are not commanded anywhere explicitly to agapao their husbands. Now, everybody's commanded to agapao their neighbor and other people. So that would include your husband, but explicit commandments, it's philandros is what's commanded, but the wives are commanded, are taught to love their husbands. And that's from philia, and andros is man, okay? How can we say we love our spouses when we don't have a favorable mind toward our spouses? I don't think you can. You have to have a favorable mind toward them. Now, I translated it that the husband render to the wife the things being due to her with a favorable mind. Right, and I footnoted it. Some manuscripts omit the words with a favorable mind. Right, I'll put that in there. Likewise, also, that the wife render to the husband things due to him with a favorable mind. This is all in italics when he said likewise. It's a repetition of the same thought that he just got introduced. So I take this to be the conjugal relations. Any question? All right. What we're going to do is we're going to go start with verse 4 next week. I think you're going to see why this is conjugal relations in the following verses. Okay. All right. I'm going